Open up our Bibles to Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5, if you would. We're going to be in Ephesians 5, verses 15 and 16 to be exact. Just two verses this morning. Paul's been taking us through a number of different topics, but mostly it's been about putting off sin and maintaining a separation from the sinful world around us. That's been the general theme of the verses we've considered so far in chapter 5. And now as we kind of go over the crest of the middle of chapter 5, we are being confronted with this truth in verses 15 and 16 that is so often quoted. And it's a truth that causes us to look at our lives and the brevity of our lives and consider it with a bit more sobriety. He's going to tell the Ephesians here in verses 15 and 16 that they need to pay close attention to their lifestyles and then let the details of their way of life be considered carefully. He brings back this verb here, to walk, in this verse. In the beginning of verse 15, to walk. Peripateo in the Greek, actually. It's one of Paul's favorite words to describe a way of life or a pattern of one's life. And we've talked about this before. To walk or the walk of a Christian or a person is the behavior that marks your life, that defines your life. That's what a walk is. When Paul tells his readers that something about how they ought to walk or about the walk they've been walking, he's talking about their lifestyle. And he does this throughout Ephesians. So before we actually get into this verse, let's go back, if you would, back into chapter 2, and then we'll march our way back up to chapter 5, verse 15. I want to show you all of the different instances in which Paul uses this word walk. And he's bringing up the same concept over and over again, walking as a behavioral pattern of life. So he starts out this theme. This is a major theme in Ephesians, and we're actually culminating it here this morning in chapter 5, verse 15. But he starts back in chapter 2, verse 2, and this is the first mention of walking. He describes our walk before salvation as a walk in which we formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. That was the life we walked in. Then down in verse 10 of chapter 2, he uses the verb again, bringing up the same thing. He says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would," there's our verb, "walk in them." Then, if you flip the page over to Ephesians 4, verse 1, he brings up the same theme. He says, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called." Then down in verse 17, he brings it up, and actually in this verse we see it twice. He says in chapter 4, verse 17, "Therefore this I say, and testify in the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk in the futility of their mind." Then in chapter 5, verse 2, he brings it up for the second to last time. He says that we ought to walk in love, just as Christ also loved us and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice as a fragrant aroma. So our lifestyle ought to be one which is characterized by love. We got into that a number of weeks ago as we were working through chapter 5, verse 2. Then he says in chapter 5, verse 8, actually I guess this is technically the second to last time he uses the verb. He says, "For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light." So your behavioral pattern ought to match your profession. That's what he's saying. So Paul clearly cares deeply about our walks. He cares about our lifestyles. And that's the orthopraxy of the orthodoxy, right? Straight doctrine, straight practice. You can't have straight doctrine without living it out in straight practice, and vice versa. The practice part is the walking. And so he goes in that statement of chapter 2, verse 10, he goes so far as to argue that our walks are the very definition of why we're saved. He says we were saved not just to be decorations on the Lord's shelf, his accomplishments, and that he needed to save us just to show everyone how powerful he is, although that is an aspect of salvation. Rather, he saved us for good works. So these walks that we do, that we're to walk in the good works, are to be definitional to this new lifestyle that we have as believers. Our walks have been designed by God to not be in darkness anymore, but for the purpose of doing good works prepared beforehand. We're to walk in those good works as a way of life now. And now in our text this morning, in verses 15 and 16, he's going to bring up the very last iteration, the very last mention of our walks. And he's going to call us to be careful in these walks. He says in chapter 5, verse 15 and 16, that we need to see to our ways of life as the integral aspect of our faith. In our two verses here this morning, Paul offers us this new, overarching, and yet also specific exhortation related to these walks that we have before us. Let's read it together here, and then I'll break it up, and I'll show you how I want to move through these two verses. He says this to the Ephesians in verses 15 and 16. Therefore, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. So it's short, 2 verses, 1 sentence, but packs a punch. I propose that we work through it in 4 points. Each half verse gets a point, and we'll work through that chronologically. He says first that we ought to walk carefully, then we ought to walk wisely, then we ought to walk efficiently, and then we ought to walk motivatedly. I don't think that's a real word, but it's going to be a point for our message here. I couldn't find a better word, so I just created one. Motivatedly. It's an adverb of motivated. So we walk carefully, wisely, efficiently, and then also motivatedly. Let's start at the very beginning, verse 15, the first half of verse 15, where he exhorts us to walk carefully. He says the first phrase here, therefore, look carefully how you walk. Look carefully how you walk. You know, our Legacy Standard Bible translation translates it, look carefully how you walk. The NASB, if you have an NASB in your lap, says, be careful how you walk. Slightly different. The KJV, interestingly, puts it, see then that ye walk circumspectly. I really like that word, circumspectly. You know, the idea is that we're to be careful about how we walk. It's pretty simple. And we're to be intentional. We're to be concerned about how we walk, with even the details of every aspect of our lives. That's the idea here. It's a specific sort of intentionality and care with how you walk. And not just a general trajectory, but also the details of your life. And not just the patterns, but the specifics. We need to look carefully how we walk. And it's to focus intently on our every step. That's the idea here. Now, this principle can really be found throughout the Bible. Perhaps the most helpful cross-reference would be Proverbs 4. If you've got a Bible, flip over to Proverbs 4 with me. I want you to see this. Proverbs 4 is where we get this, perhaps for the first time in propositional truth form, this idea that we need to be careful with every detail of our lives. Proverbs 4 really is sort of just a universal truth or collection of wisdom compiled in a package. Some scholars think that Proverbs 4, or Proverbs in general, the first few chapters were some sort of manual for young men in the court. As Solomon was training up young men for leadership positions, he would push them through the curriculum of the first few chapters of Proverbs, especially chapter 4. We don't know if that was the case or if it was just more of a general collection of proverbs, of proverbial wisdom. But either way, Proverbs 4 here is full of ethical wisdom that's really helpful for us to consider even all these centuries later. Look at the opening stanza here of Proverbs 4. He says, "Hear, O sons, the discipline of a father, and pay attention that you may know understanding. For I give you sound learning. Do not forsake my instruction. When I was a son to my father, tender and the only son before my mother, then he instructed me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live. Acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. Do not forget and do not turn away from the sayings of my mouth." And then jump down to verse 20 of the same chapter, chapter 4 of Proverbs. He says, "My son, pay attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings." Notice how Solomon here is narrowing in, and he's calling for an extremely focused and intentional application of his advice here for every decision that these young men make. He says, son, pay attention to my words, incline your ear, angle your ears in such a way as you will be more receptive to what I'm telling you. Do not let them deviate from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them and healing to all his flesh. Guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. Now look at verses 25 through 27 and key in on the particular exhortation and how specific he gets here. He says, let your eyes look directly ahead, verse 25. And even let your eyelids be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the track of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot from evil. Super specific, right? He started general, and then he gets more and more narrow and more particular with his advice. The imagery here is meant to bring out a sense of seriousness in the reader. We're to, verse 25, look directly ahead. We're to let your eyelids be fixed straight in front of you. We're to, verse 26, watch the track of our feet, to turn not to the right and not to the left. It's a call to concentration at the helm. It's a seriousness of navigational awareness. One commentator on the Proverbs, particularly this passage, wrote, Proverbs provides both a goal and a route. The goal is successful living, and the route is the way of wisdom. And we could well add that in light of these verses here, that the route isn't just a general, loosely defined meandering. What is it? It's a straight and a narrow path. According to Solomon here at the end of chapter 4 of Proverbs, the prescribed path of righteousness is one which requires extreme focus and particular intentionality behind every foot placement. Literally, that's the imagery here. You turn back to Ephesians with me. I really wanted you to see that terminology and that phrasing and import that back into Ephesians 5, because I think no doubt Paul had Proverbs 4 in mind as he is writing Ephesians 5. He wants us to be very particular with our steps and our placement, every decision we make. I've pretty much given this up since moving to Nebraska, but when I was back on the West Coast, where there are mountains, sometimes people ask me, what do you miss about the West Coast? Really, the only thing is mountains. I love everything else about Nebraska. I do sometimes yearn for the mountains. And I remember growing up near the mountains, having access to the mountains, I would love mountain biking. Don't so much do that anymore here because there are no mountains, but back in California, mountains were the back door, 15-minute drive. You could be at the foothills of a big mountain. And I would do mountain biking all the time, and I recall a number of times, basically every time I would do a big mountain, it would be kind of slow and meandering on the way up, right? It's a slog. It's 1 or 2 miles an hour going up these steep inclines, these sort of wide fire road paths, all the way up to the top of the mountain or the ridge or wherever I'm going, to then drop down to the other side. And when I would do this, it would be easy going on the way up, but then on the way down, it's a totally different experience. And I learned this the hard way many times, that you have to pay attention to every single movement, every shift in your balance, every grab of the brakes, every nuanced way you're looking and way you're tilting your head, because going down the mountain, oftentimes it's single track. Often that means there's only enough space for one bike, if that. And often, if you lean too far in one direction or take a turn too fast, you end up broadside of a tree and unconscious on the side of the trail. That particular thing didn't happen to me, but once I was toward the bottom of a mountain once, there was this big drop. I don't know, 10-foot drop, sort of like a fun obstacle. And I had not done it before, but I figured, I'm advanced enough now, I can handle this. And so I went off this drop, but I miscalculated my speed. I wasn't very careful with understanding how fast I was to be going down this little drop. In fact, I was too slow, ironically. The back tire of my bike caught the lip of this little cliff, and it petered me forward like this, ended up face into a rock, and thankfully I was wearing a helmet, and the helmet did its job, but I was still unconscious on that trail for a little while. I don't know how long. I remember waking up, and I did have a friend who I was riding with who didn't stop for me. I woke up, and I was kind of confused about where I was and what was going on, and eventually I figured I must be on a mountain I think I know this mountain, and I kind of wandered my way back and found my truck. He was waiting there for me, saying, what happened to you? And I said, you could have stopped and checked on me. How about that? In any case, I remember on my way home driving, and I forgot multiple times. This is a vivid memory. Ironically, I remember this, but not much else. I remember driving in circles in town, not sure where I was going because of my brain damage, I suppose, for that day. I remember, like, Jen called me and was like, where are you? And I was like, I think I'm on my way home. That's right. Yeah, I'm on my way home. And so I ended up home, and she says I told her the story about 15 times over and over and over and over again because I didn't know that I had just told her a minute before. That explains a lot about me in general. I think there is some probable lasting damage going on in there. But the point that I'm trying to make here with all these other comments is that you need to be careful about every particular nuanced approach when the stakes are high. And I wasn't, right? I didn't take the time to think about how fast I ought to go down this little cliff thing. And I went too slow. I didn't measure my speed. I probably had a little bit too much brake. Paul here is trying to get us to be careful, to avoid miscalculations. I would have done well to apply this mindset here in verse 15 to the way I rode my bike down that mountain. The point is that even little miscalculations can lead to disastrous consequences. This life is a high-stakes situation. The life we've been given is the only life we've got, right? You've got however many years the Lord has chosen to give you before you die, and you've got to make each and every decision with carefulness and strategic intentionality. And if we don't, bad consequences happen. That's how this life works. Every calculation of a speed around a corner, every calculation of every step, every foot placement matters. Every decision has immense ramifications. That's the idea here. You know, this is about mountain climbing here, but this is a quote that I've appreciated it recently. Edward Whymper, in a book about mountain climbing, says, "Remember that courage and strength are nothing without prudence, and that a momentary negligence may destroy the happiness of a lifetime. Do nothing in haste. Look well to each step, and from the beginning, think what may be the end." That's about mountain climbing, but that could have just come out of a Christian book about how to live a Christian life, right? Look well to the end and be careful about every step. That's what Paul is getting at here. This is the level of intentionality that he wants the Ephesians to pick up on and apply. They're to intentionally focus on every move. They're to look to every step. They're to carefully consider how each decision in their lives will affect their walks in general, the patterns in general. And we're to follow suit. So that's the first half of verse 15. Therefore, look carefully how you walk. And then he follows it up with this. Not as unwise, but as wise. So we need to walk wisely. Not as unwise, but as wise. Two statements, one negative, one positive. Actually, the first one's sort of a double negative if you look at it. Walk not as unwise, which then obviously means walk wisely, right? And he's saying, avoid walking without wisdom. Quit being in a state of not having wisdom as you navigate life. Wisdom is an essential ingredient for walking well. And we've already seen that we need to be careful in the first part of verse 15 in our walks. It takes intentionality and care for each individual decision in life. And now Paul's saying that in order to do that well, you have to have wisdom. That's the only way. Just listen to how Proverbs describes the value of wisdom. You don't need to turn there. I'll just read it to you. Proverbs 3:13-18. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who obtains discernment. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her produce is better than fine gold. She is more precious than pearls, and nothing you desire compares with her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and glory. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her pathways are peace. She is a tree of life to those who seize her, and all those who hold her fast are blessed. That's the value of wisdom. Proverbs 16:16 says, how much better is it to acquire wisdom than fine gold? To acquire understanding is to be chosen above silver. You know, in the current market of silver, if you follow precious metals, that's especially important, especially valuable, right? How much better is it to acquire wisdom than precious metals? To acquire understanding than silver? We should be feverish for wisdom. We should be like the gold rushers who upended their comfortable lives in the East Coast to hustle out to California during the gold rush and to just try to stake a claim anywhere they could, hoping to find gold, right? That's the idea here. We're to be feverishly full of appetite for wisdom. And the source, of course, we know, is the Lord. Proverbs 2:6. For Yahweh gives wisdom. He is the hills in which the wisdom is hidden. For Yahweh gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and discernment. And then, of course, implicitly, how do we get that wisdom? Well, James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So we are to walk carefully, and we are to walk wisely. And now here, in the beginning of verse 16, he doubles down and gets even more particular, and he says, therefore, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time. So here we need to walk efficiently. That's what he's telling us here. There's another interesting verb here at the beginning of verse 16. Back in the original Greek, the verb here in verse 16 carried this classical sense of purchasing or obtaining by payment. That's what the verb that we see as redeem really means. If you wanted to buy something in the marketplace, you'd use this verb to describe that transaction, that interaction. It was a word that brought to mind a sort of a purchasing contractual relationship between two people. That's why we see it here as the English verb, redeeming, in our LSBs. It's a word picture from Paul. That's what's going on here. It's a sort of illustration embedded in the verb. He's bringing to the mind's eye an image of someone buying up all the units of time for sale. If there were a bunch of units of time on the table, the person who would obey this command would be the one who's spending everything they've got to get those units of time and use them wisely. It's like the image of the first person into the department store at 6 a.m. on Black Friday, buying all the flat screen TVs, right? Why do you need more than one flat screen TV? Who knows? They just want them all, right? It's a good deal, and there's a scarce amount of them. That's the idea here. To redeem the time is to buy it all up because it's useful and it's valuable. But if you have another translation in your lap, you'll probably see a different word there in verse 16. The NASB or the ESV both do it similarly. They both actually sidestep the actual translation of the illustration, and they sort of put the concept through in more of an interpretational form. They say, making the most of your time. It's a more dynamically equivalent translation because it doesn't actually show us the illustration that Paul's getting at, which is a transaction of a purchase. But that doesn't make it wrong. In fact, that's exactly what Paul's trying to get us to think of, right? He uses an illustration, but this is the principle. You buy it all up, you purchase it, you redeem it to make the most of it, right? That's the interpretation. Make the most of it. We're to purchase as many moments for ourselves as possible in order to give them all a purpose under our ownership. And the whole concept here is undergirded by the presupposition that there's a scarcity of these moments, right? Anytime he brings up economics or the purchasing of things in a marketplace, he's done this a number of times in Ephesians, he's always trying to get us to realize that there is a scarcity involved. There's not unlimited moments of time. Time is finite. Our time is finite. We're not going to live forever. In fact, we're likely not even going to live as long as we think we're going to live. Paul's trying to get that through to us. There's coming a day, probably sooner than you'd like to think, when you will die. Your diaphragm will flex for the very last time. Your lungs will fill with air for the very last breath. Maybe it'll be in your own bed while you're asleep. That would be nice. But maybe it'll be in a hospital bed with all sorts of machines attached to you. Maybe it'll be while you're sitting in a passenger seat of a car with glass strewn about and sirens wailing and coming closer in the distance. We don't know how our death is going to look. It's just going to be a surprise to each of us. We don't know when or how death will come knocking on the doors, but it is going to come knocking on the doors, and it's not going to call ahead and see if it's a good time. That's not how it works. Time is finite. Our days are numbered, and that makes them valuable. You see what he's doing here? We know this intellectually, of course. I don't think I'm convincing anyone that you're going to die. This is not a revelation for the first time. Rather, and Paul knows that too, he's just trying to get you to realize something that you already know intellectually and then live in light of it. That's the idea here. The problem Paul has with the Ephesians, and the problem that we have today, isn't that we don't know that time is scarce and valuable. The problem is that we fail to live in light of that fact, isn't it? We all know this. We just ignore it most of the time. We're notoriously bad at connecting the dots between our knowledge of the brevity of life and our actual day-to-day, moment-to-moment decisions. We may know that our days are numbered and that we could die at any time, but we act like we've got a long time left before that'll happen. We don't let that knowledge bear out in our decisions on a daily basis. Verse 16 here is trying to break that. It's trying to break us out of that foolishness. Therefore, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time. Buy up every moment. Make the most of every minute of every hour of every day. Because you're going to stand before the Lord someday, and you're going to answer for your conduct in this life and how you spent all of those moments. Time is the most scarce commodity in this world. You can find ways to find more food, find ways to find more money, even more precious metals, even more wisdom. You cannot buy more time. Impossible. We're all going to look back on this life that the Lord gave us, and when we stand before him, we're going to be ashamed by the sin that we've committed, of course, but I think we're also, and maybe we don't think about this as much, we're going to be embarrassed by the sheer wastage of the time that we've wasted. I could easily bring up statistics on how much time the average American wastes on ridiculous things. I don't want to insult you guys. I know you know that. We all know that there's room for improvement on this. Not a single person here, including me, can honestly say that you don't use every bit of time on good and perfect things. It doesn't take much for us to start to feel the prick of conviction. We don't have to talk about this for more than just a minute or two before we're all thinking about all the wasted time we let slip away even this past week. But here's the thing about wasted time and laziness. And I want to make this point. None of us end up wasting time and slipping into laziness because we're intentionally seeking out laziness. We're not ever cognitively determining that it would be a good thing to be lazy right now. I just don't know of anyone who's ever talked that way or thought that way, at least not any believer who's trying to use their life for God-honoring purposes. I'm convinced that laziness, at least in our generations, in our worst sins, I'm convinced that laziness is one of our generation's worst sins. Because we don't often remind ourselves of the difference between laziness and rest. We often pursue rest and slip into laziness, right? There's a difference there, and there's a biblical difference. You don't need to turn there. You can feel free to jot these down. I'm going to just give you some proverbs which help us think through this, the difference between righteous rest and sinful laziness. There's a difference, and we can determine the difference. We can discern it. Proverbs 10:5, we see that laziness is really just poorly timed rest. If you want a definition of laziness, poorly timed rest. Proverbs 10:5, he who gathers in the summer is a son who acts insightfully, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. So the season, the work that is available, determines the proper action, right? If it's summertime, you act insightfully. If you're sleeping during the harvest, you're a son who acts shamefully. Proverbs 20, verse 4 echoes the same truth. The sluggard does not plow from winter on, so he begs during the harvest and has nothing. It's not the act itself. There's nothing wrong with sleeping in the winter when there are no crops to harvest. It's sleeping in the summer when the crops are out waiting to be harvested that makes it sinful, right? There's nothing wrong with not plowing during the summer and fall. That's when that sort of work ought not to be done. There's nothing wrong with not plowing during the summer and fall because that's not when that work is even able to be done. It's not plowing during the late winter and the spring that's lazy. That's what he's saying here. Because that's when that work needs to be done. The question we need to be asking ourselves is there work to be done right now? Even in this moment. He's talking about seasons and agriculture here as an illustration for us to get the concept. In this moment, right before me, at this time, I'm deciding whether I'm going to rest or I'm going to work. What is there to be done? Is there work to be done? Is this the proper time for rest? Is this the premeditated time for rest? Is this the day I've set aside for rest? Is this the time of day even within the 24-hour clock that I've set aside for rest? Or am I misusing the time? If the necessity of the work outweighs the opportunity to rest, then we need to responsibly triage rest out of the equation, even if we're tired, in order to spend that time working. Laziness, fundamentally, is poorly timed rest. Proverbs also teaches us that laziness is deceptively tempting. The beginning of laziness is often well-intentioned rest, maybe even set aside time of rest. And so you've passed the first filter, the first checkpoint, and you say, this is time for rest, I'm going to rest. But then often, if we're not careful, it slips into laziness. Proverbs 6:9. How long will you lie down, O sluggard? He wasn't a sluggard when he lied down necessarily, but he's still lying down, so he's a sluggard. When will you arise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and your poverty will come on you like a vagabond, and your want like an armed man. Laziness doesn't always look like laziness. It's often couched in the veneer of a little rest. It gradually pulls us in until we're so drunk on rest that we fail to see the foolishness of our lazy state, and we end up making excuses to defend ourselves. Like the sluggard says here in Proverbs 22:13, there's a lion outside. I'll be killed in the streets. We come up with all sorts of excuses, right? Laziness isn't the ultimate consequence itself. Rather, it actually brings about even worse circumstances into our lives. Laziness leads to continual craving without real satisfaction. So it's like this. It's this disgusting, sort of embarrassing spiral into even more laziness and want and desire. Proverbs 13:4. The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing. Laziness leads to a distortion of the perception of value. So then you even make yourself even worse into this spiral. Proverbs 12:27. A slack-handed man does not roast his prey, but the wealth of a man is precious for the diligent. The lazy man doesn't even rightly value the little rest that he has. To be lazy is to not even be able to enjoy rest. We all know this, even experientially to some degree. The hardest working days are the days in which the rest is sweetest, right? Those weeks when rest is hard to come by, that rest becomes sweeter. It becomes more enjoyable. You're able to enjoy it to a fuller extent every minute you have it. That's the truth. The Bible said it first. We just kind of figured it out implicitly. Proverbs 26:16, the sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can respond with a discreet answer. So laziness even makes us unperceptible to common knowledge. We just become wise in our own eyes, and we can't even see the truth in front of us. So the question for us is will we heed the exhortation from Paul here in verse 16 of chapter 5? Will we redeem the time? Will we buy it up and make the most of it? Will we use every minute and make every decision with the scarcity of time in mind? That's the question. That's what Paul's trying to get us to wrestle with. James 4, verse 14, gives us a good window into the scarcity of time. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're a vapor that appears for a little while and then it vanishes away. He's borrowing from Ecclesiastes, which talks about life as a vapor, a mist. It sort of is there as a fogginess in the morning, and then the sun comes out and the rays just disperse it. The foolishness is waking up and looking at the fog and saying, oh, I guess this is the world I live in now. I will just have this mist forever. Rather, it's going to go away in just a matter of a few minutes. That's life. That's the time that we have. John 9:4, we must work the works of him who sent me, as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So what time is it? Is it daytime? Work. Is it nighttime? Well, you can't work at nighttime. He's talking there of day and night as in big, long eras of time. This is the church age. This is the time we evangelize. We'll get into that in a minute. Paul's going to get there. But when our life is over, you can't work anymore, at least not in the way that you can work now. 1 Peter 1:17, and if you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your sojourn. Conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your sojourn. We're sojourners. That would have been a good class name. Sojourners, right? We are people who are just here for a little while. You put too much stock into this life, and you get all sorts of twisted around and not understanding how you ought to use every moment. You keep filling up the storehouses until you're dead. And then what was the point, right? You keep seeking for yourself comfort and niceties until the end when you can't even enjoy them. Psalm 39, 4 and 5, Yahweh, cause me to know my end. And what is the extent of my days? Let me know how transient I am. Boy, what a sentence. If you're going to get a tattoo, that'd be a good one. Let me know how transient I am. That's a good reminder. That should be our prayer. Yahweh, cause me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Behold, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing before you. Surely every man, even standing firm, is altogether vanity. Psalm 90, verse 12. This was part of our reading this morning after our hymn. Teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. That ought to be our prayer every time we realize that we've lost perspective on the brevity of this life. And I guarantee you, probably lose perspective on the brevity of life this week. Because you're human. This is how this works. We're not perfect. We need to constantly be building systems into our lives, patterns into our walks that will cause us to remember the brevity of life. We need to be praying things like this. Lord, remind me of the shortness of my life. Remind me of the unpredictability of my future. Teach me to rightly value every minute of every day and to use them in the proper way for your glory. Boy, if we just prayed that every morning, what would that do? Yes, it would cause the Lord to help us in that way, but also it would just program our own minds, right? Wake up with the brevity of life on mind. That's the idea here. That's what Paul wants to see. And finally, he rounds out the passage with the very last phrase of verse 16. He says, do all this because the days are evil. Therefore, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. So we need to walk motivatedly because the days are evil. It's no secret that these days are filled with evil. I don't think I've got to work very hard to convince any of you that this world is in an era that's dominated by darkness and evil. Paul describes it like that. We've seen it plenty of times in chapter 2. The ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that's now working the sons of disobedience, is dominating this era, these days. He makes sin run rampant across the world. Satan prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking who he might devour. He's constantly working to organize his legions of demons to wreak as much havoc as possible before Christ comes back and put them in their place. We know that the eschatological future is bright, right? We know that. We're good premillennialists. We know that there is a coming day when Christ will come back and set all things right. He will put evil in its place, and he will establish his kingdom, and then he'll usher us into the eternal state. And we will live in a glorious state here on earth with Christ, working and laboring in a different way than we are now for glory. We know that the future is bright, but we also know that we don't know how much longer God has planned for us down here dealing with the evilness of these days. And we just need to realize that these days are evil, and that ought to motivate us. Part of living in light of the evilness of the days is simply realizing that they're not going to come to an end at any point that we can predict. And once these evil days are ended, there won't be any more chance for us to share the life-giving truth of the gospel with those who are caught up in the evil. I think this is a nod toward evangelism. Redeem the time because the days are evil. There are people around us in this world right now, lost in the evilness of these days, and they need the truth of the gospel. We've got it. Are we redeeming the time by sharing it? That's what Paul's getting at. That's what he's getting at here in these two verses. Walk carefully, walk wisely, walk efficiently, and walk motivatedly. I want to end with this little quote from George Whitefield. He says this, I'll just let him speak for himself. A true faith in Jesus Christ will not suffer us to be idle. No, it is an active, lively, restless principle if it fills the heart so that it cannot be easy till it is doing something for Jesus Christ. It fills the heart so that the heart cannot be easy or rest till it is doing something for Jesus Christ. That's who we are. We're people who cannot even fathom, once we're reminded of it like this, in this moment of sobriety right now, we cannot even fathom wasting time on anything that is not for Jesus Christ, right? Now the trick is to remind ourselves and get our minds back to this moment of sobriety over and over and over again each day. It's easy to say amen right now. It's harder to do it every day when that rest and that laziness is tempting. May we be reminded of it constantly. May the Lord do his work in us. Let's pray. Oh Lord, God, you are perfect, you are honorable, you demand much of us, including our time. God, we know that even the phrase of our time is sort of nonsensical. We know it's not ours, it's yours. We are simply stewards of whatever moments you've given us on this planet. Lord, may we use these moments for your honor and your glory. Lord, may we not waste them. May we stand before you someday and say, Lord, I know we're not perfect, but we tried our utmost to use every moment of every day and made the most of it. Lord, would you be honored in this, in your name? Amen. All right, Pastor Jesse's in Luke over in the main auditorium. I'll see you there in a few minutes.